What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? It is Michael here with Scott, and today we're going to be presenting an extensive analysis of The Outer Worlds, explaining why we believe the game is not as good as everyone thinks.
If you tuned into our YouTube live stream where we discussed our thoughts on this topic, and thank you to those who stopped by, then you'll know there's no cause for alarm. We're not here to say that The Outer Worlds is a bad game, because it's not. It's definitely a decent game, and we both enjoyed our first playthroughs a lot. However, it isn't as nearly as deep or profound or fleshed out as many people are giving it credit for.
Today we're going to explain our thoughts as to why this is the case, breaking the video down into sections that we can judge different aspects of the game on, with timestamps in the description. Of course, it's worth addressing the concept that everything is subjective, and whether or not you think a game is a 10 out of 10 or a 7 out of 10 does come down to preference somewhat. However, at the end of the day, we're still striving for some sort of objectivity by looking at various features that are known to define what makes an RPG good. Things like in-depth choice and consequence options that impact the world around you, smart build mechanics that encourage replayability and diverse character creation, fleshed out world building that explores NPCs and factions in a multifaceted way, and well-written, memorable companions who have certain ideals and can be impacted by your choices and perhaps may influence your own decisions. You get the idea. If one game has more impactful choices and consequences than another, that's something you can definitely measure. In this video, we'll be comparing The Outer Worlds to other RPGs such as Fallout 4, Skyrim, and especially Fallout New Vegas. Fallout New Vegas is looked at by many as a benchmark for what a good RPG should be like, and it got around the same rating for some of its reviews as The Outer Worlds did, and in other cases, The Outer Worlds was even reviewed with higher scores, reaching 9 out of 10s and so on. People are calling it the spiritual successor to New Vegas, and saying it's the ultimate RPG experience. Yes, The Outer Worlds is a good game, but it's definitely not a better RPG than New Vegas, and while both games have their faults and no game is perfect, we think New Vegas is a clear-cut winner. And keep in mind, this is a view we've developed after hundreds of hours of combined playtime on The Outer Worlds, many playthroughs, and loads of story choice testing. The thing about The Outer Worlds is that while it's enjoyable, it could have been way better, and suffered when it came to replayability due to many factors, two large ones being that it was short, and another being that there was a bit of an illusion of choice and meaningful impact. We'll discuss the issues with length later on, but basically you can do everything without rushing in 20 to 25 hours, and upon further replays you can cut serious length off that time. We'll explain the illusion of choice more soon, but in a nutshell, the game feels like there's lots of choice and impact and options if you only play it once. We made a few Twitter polls which helped confirm these thoughts. Basically, 70% of responders had only played The Outer Worlds once. If you add in those who have played it twice, you've got a combined 88% of the total. So 70% played it once, and then interestingly, 72% of people felt like their choices were actually meaningful and changed things a lot in the game, with the other 28% of people, more than a quarter, feeling like it didn't. Then when you look at what people would rate it out of 100, 54% of people rated it between 80 and 100, and 31% between 70 and 80. Now, we don't have any sure way of knowing who picked what, but I have a sneaking suspicion that generally speaking, those who played the game once are the people rating the game highest. I mean, my internal rating for The Outer Worlds was probably around 8 out of 10 the very moment I finished my first playthrough too. We also know the game didn't necessarily have the resources that a AAA game would have behind it, so good on them for making what they did, but it was sold for a full AAA price, so we're judging it in comparison to other fully priced RPGs. Please do share the video with your friends if they've played The Outer Worlds too. So let's dive in, first starting with what makes an RPG good in the first place. Also, it should go without saying, but spoiler alert. So what is an RPG and what makes it good? Well, at the simplest level, a role-playing game is a game that lets you play a certain role in a fictional world, but it's not as simple as the name suggests. We think the term RPG has been watered down over time and applied to many things. The term RPG often gets conflated with what are essentially role-playing mechanics in action-adventure games. When people are referring to RPG games, where RPG elements are the defining features, they tend to be talking about things inspired by tabletop role-playing games like D&D, games where you can craft a character to take take on one of many roles, perhaps choosing classes and having a story for your character, and then you can take this character through a world that you have the ability to impact. RPGs focus on things like choice and consequence too, different playstyles and approaches to missions, world building, and statistical elements to build your character, with these elements such as perks and skills even reflected in choice and consequence possibilities. So a great RPG ends up being an amalgamation of many features that translate into an experience that allows you to choose a certain role in a world to play, and does it well. A huge appeal is that obviously in your own life you're limited by your genetics and you can only be you, but escaping into the world of an RPG game lets you be people who are completely unlike you, or just one facet of you but super enhanced. So let's do an analysis of choice and consequence in the Outer Worlds. Did they nail it, or is it a weaker area than some people realized?
Alright, so this is one of the biggest topics to discuss, and it's of pivotal importance to most RPG players. As we said, part of what makes role-playing games appealing is the ability to play through the game differently by making different choices and getting different outcomes. But we aren't just talking about be a good guy, get X, or be a bad guy, get Y. Choice and consequence is more complicated than that. The idea of role-playing is essentially living out another life in a fictional world. If you screw over some friends in real life, they may come back to bite you, or if you spend all your time in the gym, you may get a lot stronger, but not have as much time to make your brain sharper. Everything has choice and consequence. But before we talk about choice in relation to the Outer Worlds, let's look at some examples to show the different ways choice can be approached in RPGs. The way we see it, there are generally two main ways that developers deliver choice to the player. The first is the choice of path, so this would be more in line with open world games like the Elder Scrolls series. In the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, you begin the game and then the world is your oyster. You can choose to just go hunt deer, or you can choose to wander off to Windhelm and join the Dark Brotherhood, or you can follow the main storyline and fulfill the Dragonborn prophecy, or you can just ignore all of that and go become a master wizard. It's the kind of open world game format where you have an incredibly vague backstory, a simple setup, and the potential to roleplay almost whoever you want. Now, on the flip side, with Skyrim's questlines, there's rarely a lot of choice. Sure, Imperial vs. Stormcloaks is the main example of questline choice, but as for the Dark Brotherhood or the Thieves Guild or the main storyline, at the end of the day, those questline outcomes and consequences all look the same. Skyrim would be an example of a game that has lots of choice via the path you take, but not a lot of consequences. If anything, the consequence just becomes the opportunity cost of choosing to build your character as an Argonian assassin in the Dark Brotherhood versus an orc member of the Companions. Now, obviously, every single RPG has not been, or does not even need to be, an open world game, but there is a catch. When you make the decision to create a more hub-based game, a more linear experience where you're ushered along a certain path, consequence becomes a lot more important, because you don't have the ability to just up and leave and become a professional thief in Riften. It becomes about how you approach the situation and also the outcome of the situation, which leads to new scenarios. So imagine one developer method is about how many different paths you can take from the origin point, and these paths lead down a rather simple questline. And then the other developing method creates a single path from an origin point, but at certain points throughout the game path, there are multiple doors, all of which lead down separate new paths that branch into new scenarios, and so on. Here's a visual idea of what I'm talking about. Now, like we said, games often have a mixture of both, but one philosophy is usually predominant. Ultimately, I think a good way to measure the degree of choice delivered in a game would be to ask people what their experience was and see how much it lines up with yours. In Skyrim, for example, it is common for people's first experiences to be radically different. Now, that's simply because they chose to go do different things or go in different directions. In other more focused RPGs, the differences are more like, I chose to kill him, which caused her to betray me, so I did XYZ, versus another person's version of events. So clearly, the Outer Worlds from a design perspective, and virtue of it being a hub-based, somewhat linear experience, it should align with the latter method of delivering choice. It seems the Outer Worlds set out to give players a different experience by allowing them a great deal of choice over each step in the path to the end. But this, ladies and gentlemen, is an endeavor that I feel they didn't reach as well as they could have, or as well as people have praised them for. So the Outer Worlds does not have great replayability. Take this from someone who has personally done over 10 playthroughs and spent well over 100 hours playing. Once you've played through the game twice, a board and a Phineas playthrough, you've essentially seen it all in terms of meaningful choices. So why, Scott? Why is there no replayability? Well, in RPGs, the main idea behind replayability is consequence and opportunity cost. So for example, if I'm to play a dumb melee guy that makes these 3 pivotal quest decisions, then I should end up with a very different experience to someone else. So when I go to replay the game as an intelligent smooth talker, I should end up with a very different experience. But the problem is that I don't. In the Outer Worlds, there are essentially only 3 big decisions. You have the Deserters versus Edgewater, MSI versus Iconoclasts, and then Phineas versus the Board. Now, the first of those 2 decisions can be easily reconciled. My first character, an intelligent, charismatic character, managed to broker an alliance between MSI and the Iconoclasts, as well as help Edgewater and return Adelaide to help them grow better food. But it was disappointing when I realized Michael's beefy melee character achieved the exact same outcome with a meager 55 persuade check, which only requires a base 30 persuade plus companion skill bonuses from Pavati and Felix. I mean, surely reconciling 2 ideologically opposed factions should require a little more diplomatic finesse than that. I didn't really seem to have an edge in that regard. 2 polar opposite characters managed to do the exact same thing and get the best outcome per se. So ultimately, the only decision with any necessary sacrifice is choosing between the Board and Phineas, with whom, by the way, you spend very little time with, actually getting to know him. The worst part is that it has the Fallout problem where you can basically play all the factions off one another until the very end and then just pick a side. But at least in Fallout 4, choosing a side at the end had weight to it. If you sided with the Railroad, you had to go blow up the Brotherhood of Steel, or if you were with the Brotherhood of Steel, you had to go eliminate the Railroad. It at the very least gave you consequences for your final decisions. For example, when I first decided to go with the Brotherhood of Steel, I was kind of gutted that I had to kill Deacon and the rest of the Railroad. It was a heavy choice. I wanted to bring peace between them, but it was just not an option. So I was forced to consider where my loyalties lie. But in the Outer Worlds, you're never really put in that position. What goes down on Monarch or even Edgewater is relatively unimportant to your final decisions. Why would me helping the Iconoclasts while also helping the Board not become a point of conflict where I'm forced to pick a side? The Board seems to have no problem with you helping a bunch of dissident revolutionaries, the antithesis of the corporate regime. It doesn't make sense. The only time I was ever confronted with a big choice moment was when working for the Board. If you put Adelaide in charge or diverted power to the lab in Edgewater, then Akande asks you to kill the entire town. And my companions had a big reaction. But when I went and actually did it and followed through with it, with those same companions, they didn't seem bothered at all, not even a peep from them. Outside of that one time in the whole game, across all my playthroughs, was I ever put in a kind of position where I really liked one faction, like Edgewater, a place that I had set up for success, but then had another faction I was working with ask me to wipe them out, forcing me to consider my loyalties. This all ties into one major point, and a major no-no for me in RPGs, which is that the Outer World lacks real consequence. The whole game is very non-committal. You don't have to make any choices with serious weight until the end. This lack of weighty decisions harms it in the long run. There is not enough polarization, but I think this will be best explained in comparisons. Let's look at Obsidian's previous work, Fallout New Vegas. At the start of New Vegas, you wake up in Good Springs, and the town is being harassed by a group of criminals called the Powder Gangers. Now, you can help defend the town against the Powder Gangers, causing you to become hated by the criminals. Now, when you come across the Powder Gangers, they will attack you on sight, but little did you know at the time that if you instead chose to side with the Powder Gangers, you will get pointed in the direction of the NCR Correctional Facility where their base is, and you can start a mini quest line working for them, something that you would have otherwise entirely missed. This is an example of a polarizing decision at the start of the game. You make a choice, and as a consequence, you are closed out of certain quest paths. Whereas in the Outer Worlds, you have the Edgewater as the first area, and it has the whole deserters versus township dynamic. So there's ultimately 3 options. Divert power to Botanical Lab helping Adelaide and dooming the town. You can divert power to Edgewater and convince the deserters to return, or you can do the same but convince Reed Thompson to step down, and then Adelaide runs the place. Here's my problem, none of them actually have weight. The game is too afraid of giving you consequences. Even if you screw over the entire town, Reed Thompson just gets mad at you and says that you aren't getting the regulator, to which you can just intimidate your way in or force your way in. But really? I just destroyed your whole town. You should have me arrested and hung, or you should try and punish me, kill me, report me to the board, get hostile, do something. The game is too afraid to dole out consequences for your actions. The game has choices for sure, but it does not have the weight that makes the choices truly meaningful. Without sounding too masochistic, like punish me please, it's what makes RPGs exciting. If they show you there are consequences early on, you will assume that is the case for the rest of the game and treat all these decisions with gravity. I can help the iconoclasts, an anti-board, anti-establishment, anti-OSI, dissident faction, and no one cares. I mean, at the last minute I can decide to screw over MSI, but then only MSI gets miffed. The board, the actual board of corporations, do not care if you help what they would essentially view as heretical terrorists. What? Look to New Vegas for contrast. The more polarizing faction you join, so for example the Legion, the more consequences you are going to have. I mean, if you join Caesar's Legion, you are going to have to assassinate the head of the NCR government. Joining the Legion makes you pull the trigger and pick a side. I mean, simply put, in order to follow through with the NCR Legion or Yes Man quest lines, you have to kill Mr. House. If you join Mr. House, you have to destroy the Brotherhood of Steel. No questions asked. These are the kinds of polarizing decisions that make you stop and think and consider your loyalties and decisions. You have to realize if you destroy the Brotherhood for House, you are jeopardizing your relationship with Veronica and she may abandon you. I mean, if you have Boone as a companion, he will shoot Caesar's Legion members on sight. How's that for a polarizing choice? There was only one time in the Outer Worlds where I genuinely thought my companions were going to leave me for my choices, and that's when I had to clear out Edgewater, and guess what? They didn't even budge after the fact, not to mention that Edgewater is Pavati's hometown. I didn't even have an argument with them. We'll talk about companions more later, but the point here is that there is no consequence. In order to get a companion to leave, you actually have to try really hard by doing the most obviously horrific thing to them, but even with high enough leadership skills, you can still get them to stay. I mean, even Fallout 4 has more companion polarization there. For example, Deacon and Anti-Railroad aren't compatible, or Anti-Brotherhood and Paladin Dance aren't compatible. The Outer Worlds possesses the illusion of consequence, but often without any substance behind it. Even in New Vegas, when you try and pull off an everyone get along state, you can't, and you have to make certain sacrifices and compromises. We will expand a lot on this in the world building and factions, but another point there which affects the overall plot and weight of choices is the lack of interconnection. Like, you can easily be in a position where you help every faction and barely disrupt any others. The factions don't have the interconnectedness to make the choices about them have consequences for others. For example, the whole situation on Edgewater is isolated from the whole situation on Monarch, which is isolated from the whole situation on Byzantium or Groundbreaker. Like I mentioned previously, you would think doing a bunch of quests for the dissident iconoclasts may create some conflict in your working relationship with the board or even MSI. The game doesn't want you to feel locked out by making any decisions, and I can understand that's nice, but ultimately it causes the game to feel like you aren't making any meaningful choices. The opportunity cost, aka what you lose out on by making a certain choice, is what makes the choice meaningful. It's the commitment and the sacrifice. If joining the iconoclasts means you have to forsake the luxuries of the board and potentially lose even friends like Vicar Max perhaps, then the commitment to the iconoclast cause becomes more meaningful because of the sacrifices. Whereas in the game you can actually just work with every faction with essentially zero repercussions. People may fixate on the idea you can shoot pretty much everyone, and yes, that's a choice. It's something I appreciate, but it's not a choice in the forefront of the experience. If you make a game where a big appeal is meant to be choice and consequence, then you want to put that at the forefront of the experience. The choices should exist in the main storyline, along with the consequences, what is put in front of the player. Not just, oh well, the game has choice because I can kill everyone. That's a nice touch, but not a replacement for the main experience, which should be full of choices and consequences that affect the course of the game. We'll talk more about factions later on, but the fact that this game had a board of corporations, all with potentially varied ideologies and motivations, but gave us no opportunity to influence the future of the board by helping certain corporations over others, or helping MSI back on the board, it's a shame, and ultimately it leaves us with little meaningful choice and consequence. There is choice about gameplay method, the standard combat, lockpick, hack, stealth, convince, etc., which is all fantastic, but unless that's coupled with the role-playing choices and consequences, it leaves you wanting for actual character impact on the world. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to talk statistics, all the numbers and such that are representative of your character. Here is where the Outer Worlds stuffed up, in our opinion. Like in regards to choice and consequence, the Outer Worlds often suffers because it's afraid to polarize and force the character to commit to a role that they chose. I mean, this is abundantly clear in the cheap respec option for skills and perks. But let's first have a look at all the elements of character creation, and we can talk about each one as we go. So if you don't know, we made about 6 builds for this game that are on the channel, and personally I've played about 10 different playthroughs, so there's my credentials, and I can tell you without a doubt that the Outer Worlds does not have great character creation. At first it may appear so because of all the numbers and various skills, but it's not the case. Starting with attributes, the big problem here is the limited functions of each attribute. They don't seem to affect a whole lot. All of the starting attributes affect starting skills, as is the case in Fallout New Vegas, but the attributes themselves don't do much. Strength increases melee damage and carry weight capacity, dexterity increases melee swing speed and reload speed. Right off the bat, 2 entire attributes that aren't really necessary unless you're playing a melee character. Reload speed is overrated, by the way. The third of a second or the second you save are not worth the 3 points invested into dexterity to achieve that bonus. So we have the mind attributes, intelligence, which increases critical hit damage. That's fine, but it doesn't affect skill points available per level up and doesn't do anything else. Perception increases headshot weak spot damage, which is fine, but it doesn't improve general accuracy or enemy marker distance or anything like that. You have the personality stats, charm, which gives you higher reputation bonuses and companion ability refresh, and you have temperament, which is just passive health regeneration. However, the bonuses you get for high investment in many of these attributes just isn't worth the trade-off for lowering other attributes. The penalties given for lowering attributes are often too large, and the gains are too little. The limited effects of these attribute values in combination with lowered incentive to increase many of them results in a system where some attributes can be considered redundant or not worth the investment, and other attributes, such as intelligence, are clearly superior to the rest in terms of the benefits they give. So this creates a situation where instead of polarizing your character to achieve a specialized but powerful build, you can just create a powerful build by investing in intelligence and maybe some perception and charm. The sacrifice required to achieve a very powerful build in a certain area is practically zero, because sacrificing attribute scores is really not worth it nor needed to achieve the best build setup. Who is going to actively disadvantage themselves if the payoff is not worth the price? Let's take a look at Fallout New Vegas. I may want to play a dumb, brute explosives build, so I could just dump points into strength and endurance, making me far beefier and stronger character, but I can only do this if I take from elsewhere, so I make charisma and intelligence 1. I will suffer for it with weak companions and low skill points on a level up, but I am far stronger for it in respect to a melee playstyle. I'm playing a certain specialized role, whereas in the Outer Worlds I could make intelligence below average, which gets me dumb dialogue, but what it also does is reduce my critical damage massively, a negative effect that could be mitigated with a single point investment. But say I made intelligence that low, what bonuses am I going to achieve? It's not even good for a melee build because I gimped my critical damage, and if I'm not even a melee build, strength and dexterity aren't necessary, so that leaves me with investing in either perception, charm, or temperament. Temperament a lot of the time is made redundant as you collect copious amounts of adreno from looting, and once you get the harvester perk, it's all over. So you have perception, which can give you 35% bonus to headshot and weak spot damage. Now that's probably the best option for a combat character, but here's the other caveat. The Outer Worlds is ridiculously easy in terms of combat. A lot of the time, it's just not necessary, which in our case would leave us with only charm left, but what if I'm a dumb, non-companion focused character? Charm without companions loses a lot of its value, especially when you consider that reputation boosts A, at a high level are overkill. Good charm with all the side quests and completionist style of play should pretty much get you revered all the time, and B, reputation bonuses aren't really going to matter for any character that actually picks a side and becomes hostile to another. But like we said before, the Outer Worlds doesn't really make you pick sides until the end when the game's over. Besides allegiances, the only benefit of reputation is better vendor prices, which aren't needed because A, there isn't much stuff to buy in the Outer Worlds that is useful or needed, and B, bits are plentiful through looting and questing, and if you're going to spend them, they're much better spent on tinkering your weapons or something. So ultimately, if you play a dumb character without companions or melee, you don't really have much to invest in besides perception or temperament. This is just one example, but it highlights how it can be hard to make a niche character build because a lot of the attributes are not that valuable. New Vegas, Obsidian's previous work, had a much better stat system, and there were lots of trade-offs that you had to balance. For example, you may go, I want 1 strength because I'm not using melee, and I don't need heaps of carry weight. Well, the other thing you have to consider is the strength requirement of weapons. Each weapon has a strength requirement, and if you didn't meet it, your handling of that weapon was very poor. You couldn't be very accurate. But because the advantage of 10 intelligence is so high, you may actually consider trading the points and suffering the consequences of low strength. If the Outer Worlds attributes carried a wider variety of effects, you would have more variables to consider, making each attribute have a trade-off rather than have a situation where there are a few clear best attributes and the rest are pretty meh. Look at endurance in New Vegas. Endurance determines a character's environmental resistances like poison and radiation, hit points, and healing rate. It also determines the number of implants you are allowed to use. So, when you're building your character, you need to consider all of these things, whereas in the Outer Worlds, you can just look at temperament and choose your health regen rate essentially. There is no attribute that just increases your raw base health and resistances, so it's hard to start as a beefy tank without getting the toughness perk, increasing your base health by 50%. But every character can get that. So say I have a dainty, charismatic, intelligent, dexterous kind of character, and you have a big, strong, melee brute character. Guess what? They both have the same base health. See the problem? The attribute differences are not meaningful enough. If you look at our captain build, what we call the best build, it had 1 point investment into every attribute and ends up creaming the game with companions, but can also deal out solid damage on his own, which in itself is another problem. Like I mentioned, combat is easy, but to be honest, a lot of the time I found investing in combat skills to be unnecessary from a statistical point of view. Obviously, from a fun point of view, they're good. For example, our gunslinger build is the most fun I had in combat in the Outer Worlds, period. But weapon skills just decrease weapon sways and increase critical chance. But if you're, say, a dumb character with low critical damage, who cares? The flat damage is enough. But by not having skills or attributes interact with ranged weapon damage, it means your gunslinger build does as much flat damage as your melee character with a pistol. Obviously, high intelligence and perception factors in, with crit damage and weak spot damage, but there aren't many variables. The game is not as deep as people think. Now let's talk skills in general. In the Outer Worlds, you invest into a skill group, for example, Dialogue, which will increase all of those skills, Lie, Intimidate, and Persuade, by 1 point when you select it. However, once it hits 50, you then have to invest in the skill by itself. So, say you invest in Dialogue, Persuade hits 50, and the Lie, Intimidate are at 35. Well, you can either invest in Persuade singularly or invest in the Dialogue group, but it will only affect skills below 50, so Lie and Intimidate. The idea behind this group investment system is to give you a feel for what you like before you specialize more, but this causes some massive problems for replayability and diversity of builds. Let me first address the problem of companion skill bonuses for a second. I like the idea behind it, but by adding it as just a passive boost to your skill, it makes you very overpowered, especially when these bonuses are effectively doubled by the Inspiration skill level 60 ability. Our best build with all-rounder attributes effectively uses companions to become a master at everything. You can easily get by with 50s or 60s in plenty of skills and achieve an effective level skill of 100 with companions and gear combos. It's quite OP. Simply put, if skill groups didn't exist, this wouldn't be as much of a problem. For example, because I can take the stealth group from 20 to 50 with 30 skill points, aka 3 in-game levels, I can get effective levels of 80 or higher in hacking and lockpicking with companions. So it cost me 30 points to go from 20 to 80 or 90. You can see how this is overpowered, but if companion skill boosts remained the same, but there were no skill groups, it would default make it more balanced because it would have taken 60 skill points, aka 6 levels, to get hacking and lockpicking both to 50, therefore increasing the opportunity cost. This is our criticism of skill group investment as a whole. It foregoes opportunity cost and commitment for the sake of making it easier on the player, but by removing barriers that lock lock you out from being great at everything, you diminish the replayability and individually different role-playing experiences. The other problem here is that the skills themselves, just like the attributes, aren't that great, leaving a clear few skills that are fantastic and the rest can be thrown to the wind. In my opinion, the most useful skills are Science, Lockpicking, Inspiration, and Persuade. They manage to make Science one of the most OP combat skills for two reasons. One, it increases the flat damage of Plasma, Shock, and later Corrosive and N-Ray weapons, meaning this tech skill is the only skill that actually increases flat damage. Reason number two, this skill sharply reduces the tinkering cost of weapons, which means you can upgrade your chosen weapon up to 5 levels beyond your own, constantly keeping its flat raw damage nice and high. The wig out here is that the Science skill is the damage skill. It's a far better combat skill than any investment into the actual combat skills when you consider the trade-offs, and by virtue of investing in Science, you will default get large boosts to Engineering and Medical because of the skill grouping. Lockpicking is the best skill for access to loot and convenience, and comes in handy far more than hacking does, but guess what? If you invest in Lockpicking, aka the stealth group, you're probably going to have hacking at about 50 anyways. As I mentioned before, the Inspiration 60 ability is overpowered as, doubling skill bonuses from companions, making these utility skills even higher. We also have to consider that besides the skill group investment already making it so you can be broadly proficient at the few playstyles there are, the Outer Worlds is also entirely missing certain playstyles and skills. Unarmed or hand-to-hand is completely missing from the Outer Worlds, and it's a playstyle that is loved by many RPG players who want to try and be that kung fu killer, even if it turns out to be quite a challenge. There is also no explosive skills, as well as no mines, no grenades, or other throwable explosives. The explosive type weapons are the grenade launcher and the plasma launcher, which are governed by the heavy weapon skill. Ultimately, an explosive character isn't very feasible. We just think there are some cool skills missing, and the skill group idea harms the game more than it helps it by making it easy to be good at everything, therefore de-incentivizing taking on a specific role to play in a role-playing game. The stealth skill was also made somewhat redundant through the use of the holographic shroud tool. The hologram did enhance a diplomat playthrough because you can infiltrate places with more of a double agent vibe, but it came at the expense of giving stealth characters a meaningful advantage in certain quest moments, rendering the sneak skill far less useful than in other RPGs, like Fallout games. But now we've discussed attributes and skills, which in summary we think are not as good as other RPGs because they lack the potency, complexity, and interaction that produce opportunity cost, which results in interesting and diverse builds, therefore increasing replayability from a gameplay perspective. So time to talk about perks and flaws. Let's address flaws, which I think are a fantastic role-playing idea. It's an excellent idea. We love it. So what's the problem? They're just never worth it. You see, the trade-off for taking a flaw is that you get access to a perk point. That sounds excellent. But the problem is that the perks are really crappy, or at best, they're solid. They essentially boil down to boring stat boosts that could easily be implemented as effects of attributes or skills. Now, I'm very aware that the previous Fallout games, such as New Vegas, also had boring perks. This is kind of unavoidable, but there were also many interesting gameplay-changing perks that could be cornerstones of entire builds. So there is basically zero incentive to take on these flaws because the trade-off, the extra perk point, is just not worth it. Throughout all my playthroughs, I was often looking for perks to pick that weren't dull, instead of trying to make tough decisions between 3 good perks. So as good as the flaw system is, it just doesn't work unless the perks, aka the reward for taking on the flaw, are worth sacrificing for. With the attributes being quite lackluster and many of the perks being simple stat boosts, it seems like many of the perk effects should have belonged to an attribute or skill. For example, temperament or strength could have managed base health instead of a perk. Perception could have increased the maximum time dilation meter, as well as increased the range of interactable highlights. Charm could have affected vendor buy and sell prices, as well as the effectiveness of companions like in New Vegas, and still have the leadership skills as a separate modifier. Dexterity could have affected movement speed, as well as time dilation recharge rate. The thick skin perk seems as if it should have been part of an attribute, as well as other boring resistance-based perks. But ultimately, what seems to have happened is that they limited what attributes do because you can't change them later in game, and they don't want you to commit to any sort of build or playstyle, so many of their effects were palmed off to skills and perks. But like we mentioned before, this harms the game's replayability and role-playing experience. And I want to clarify here, I'm not against basic perks like tough toughness or cheater. They would be perfectly fine if the attributes already affected those gameplay functions, but then these perks could be used to double down on your strengths or help mitigate your weaknesses. Even the good perks of the Outer Worlds don't really change the style of play, besides the ones related to having no companions. Look to New Vegas, for example. Perhaps you wanted to play a shotgun character, but shotguns aren't the best weapons in terms of armor penetration, making them hard to be feasible in the long run. However, you could get the Shotgun Surgeon perk that allows you to ignore 10 points of damage threshold, making the shotgun playstyle work, and when you combine that with the Stay Back perk, shotguns have a 10% chance per pellet to knock down an enemy. These two perks allowed you to make a very specific playstyle work well with a specific perk and attribute setup. There were many perks like this which helped you create your own individual character to roleplay. Like if you wanted to be a rootin' tootin' cowboy character, you could get the Cowboy perk, which increases damage dealt with dynamite, lever action firearms, hatchets, knives, and revolvers by 25%, making some of those earlier game weapons that are weaker more functional in the late game. It's a perk that helps create a specific role-playing experience. The way I like to think of RPGs is in layers. You have your first layer, which is your attributes or special stats, your fundamental genetics essentially. Then on top of that you have layer 2, which is your skills, which is your experience and proficiencies with certain things, adding another dynamic. And then in my opinion the third layer is perks, feats, talents, or whatever you want to call it in a certain game. But this third layer is to add more specific individuality and bonuses to help craft the final touches on a build. Then you have gear and weapons and actual story choices and factions and such, but those fundamental 3 layers help create a good base character. But the problem here is in the Outer Worlds that the attributes are not complex enough to create a meaningful base layer of genetic individuality. The skills are too easy to become proficient at, which decreases individuality further among characters, and then the perks are very basic boosts that don't really further the identity of the character. Armor Master, for example, is a great perk, but it's a great perk for pretty much every build. It's like the default level 22 boost, not a specific choice to facilitate your specific style of play. The last part I want to discuss is the aptitudes and lack of traits. In the same spirit of adding layers through attributes, skills, and perks, adding more complexity, in Fallout New Vegas, traits were additional perk-like characteristics that could be chosen at character creation. In the Outer Worlds, we have aptitudes, which are essentially little comedic backstories featuring minuscule bonuses of +1 to a skill or -3% damage taken from a certain damage type. They are largely inconsequential, and I was disappointed to find that they aren't even referenced at any point in the game, like through a dialogue option or something. So to me, this just appears as a facade of complexity or just a little character creation meme. But compare these to traits in a game like New Vegas, where you have the Four Eyes trait, or the Good-Natured trait, or the Fast Shot trait. These are all perks that further emphasize your own unique character's identity, so I was disappointed to see these missing. At the end of the day, the Outer Worlds character creation and leveling system lacks the diversity and complexity to truly create a distinct individual experience outside of a basic combat, dialogue, or stealth dynamic. Once again, this does not mean the game is bad, and in fact, it's better than a lot of other RPGs, but these days that's not saying much. And their previous work on Fallout New Vegas, while even that has its flaws, was much better at delivering you the statistical framework to facilitate role-playing a wide variety of individual and distinct character builds.
Now let's discuss the world building and factions of the Outer Worlds. So the premise of the Outer Worlds isn't bad at all. The whole idea of an alternate timeline where large business trusts were never broken up and therefore Earth developed into a super corporate society dominated by megacorporations who have since begun to colonize outer space is pretty cool. Taking place in the year 2355 in the Halcyon system, you find yourself as one of the passengers aboard the colony ship known as the Hope, which was abandoned by the board, leaving it adrift with colonists unable to be revived. The colony on Halcyon is on the verge of collapse, running low on nutritious food for the people, with disease and conflict spreading. The board are trying to enact an evil plan to reduce the strain of scarce resources on the colony. The base idea of this universe is fine, but the world building isn't as fleshed out as we would have liked. For example, in our 5 missed opportunities video, we discussed how the board was kind of portrayed as this cartoonishly evil capitalist machine without much exploration of the different different corporations, what ambitions they may have, their hidden agendas, and various interests. Being this kind of evil poster child for extreme capitalism meant that the world-building potential of the Outer Worlds was left unfulfilled. Yes, the corporations all want money, and that's kind of the point, but they'd also want power in various ways, and it would be cool to be able to help the different corporations to achieve their specific aims. Instead of being presented to players as a logo, a jingle, and a color scheme, more corporations should have been shown off as real organizations with their own company culture and real people running them who have a handful of unique goals. Like, who are Rizzos? We just know they're a huge food and beverage corporation, and we know a few products they produce and that they have an abandoned lab on Monarch, but why not take it further and let us meet a bunch of higher-ups and help them in some way? Auntie Cleo's was explored a bit on Roseway, which I appreciated, but it's not like we got to meet her or whoever is in charge. More instances of meeting the Zuckerberg behind the Facebook, so to speak, would have been appreciated. Of course, we meet the CEO of UDL because he's also the head of the board, Chairman Rockwell, but outside of this and some Space's Choice stuff in Edgewater, which was neat, there wasn't much discovery of what each corporation was truly like. In the Outer Worlds, we quickly find out that the corporations seem immoral and bad, and they are. Outside of Vic and Max saying the board helps to create a much-needed order, your perspective of them doesn't develop that much and isn't really challenged. Obviously, MSI is better than the board, but they're not even a faction on the board anymore, and we can't help MSI get back on the board and then work under Sanjar's guidance to convince the heads of other corporations to move towards a new direction or anything like that. That could have been really cool, and with Sanjar being a pretty well-written character, you can see how more examples of strongly characterized corporation leaders would add more juice to the world. I would have loved to explore more of the inner board politics for myself. Maybe some corporations are truly evil, but others are just a tad morally grey, and perhaps some are even a bit forgivable, even if they do end up having a net negative impact on the citizens of the Halcyon system. Anyway, why is having the board painted as one big baddie and not explored in enough depth such a letdown for world building? Well, the problem is that the corporations own the system. They not only own it, but they founded the colony there, and in a way they are the world, and the writers should have characterized them as much as possible and made them impactful. Even a game without super strong RPG elements, Borderlands 3, makes you get a feel for exactly what the Jacobs Corporation is like, for example, through Jacobs himself. Same deal with assisting the head of Atlas as Malawan competes against them viciously. It all helps with giving the corporation some character. It felt like things started off well with Space's Choice, with Reed Thompson and Edgewater and the wounded guy you meet at the start and so on, but then it kind of just faded away. It should be extremely clear who every single member of the board is, and we should have a better idea of what they're like. Even strong characterization of half of the corporations on the board would have been so much better. Moving on to other factions, we have the Iconoclasts, who as a standalone faction are all well and good. The downside is that this is the only substantial counter-faction in the entire game that's properly against the board. Think about it. Your reputation can improve with the Deserters, Space's Choice, Groundbreaker, Auntie Cleo, Sublight, MSI, the board, and the Iconoclasts. The Deserters are just a little inconsequential group who left Edgewater. Auntie Cleo and Space's Choice are subsidiaries of corporations on the board. Groundbreaker doesn't like the board but still cooperates with them, and MSI is not in their good graces but wants to rejoin them. Sublight is a pretty cool faction with presence on Groundbreaker and Monarch, but they're allowed to operate through a legal loophole, so even if they sometimes act at odds with the board, they're not exactly anti-board, and are just in the business of doing grey activities for profit. They're also one of the only factions you feel like you properly join, versus other factions where you more or less just help and improve reputation while serving as a kind of freelancer. Having the Iconoclasts as the only significant anti-board faction is kind of limiting if you don't really agree with their philosophies, and besides, they can't make any lasting impact in the story anyway. They're only relevant to Monarch, and they're just not formidable enough. Of course, Phineas is anti-board, but he's not a faction, is he? And he's the only main story endgame option for siding against the board, and he's not very fleshed out anyway. Obviously, his character is helped by having some mystery, but he still could have been integrated into the world and story much more. Overall, with both Phineas and the board not characterized strongly, it puts you in a scenario where the two big main story options didn't really dive that deep. I feel like there's some factions I'm missing out on here, but there isn't really. The only factions that had actual weight were MSI, the Iconoclasts, and and the board, but with the storyline a bit short, opportunity to really expand the lore on these factions and other factions became limited. Another thing I found a bit disappointing was the lack of perspectives that unfold with the world building. So let's take New Vegas's most conventionally morally abhorrent faction, Caesar's Legion. You first hear about Caesar's Legion as this brutal, slaver, almost barbaric kind of faction. Then you get to Nipton and Vulpes has crucified half the town and killed the rest. But then he contrasts this by speaking kind of eloquently and saying he won't kill you. This piqued my interest a little bit. Then you get exposed to characters like Boone and other NCR characters who espouse their hatred for the faction and talk about the ongoing conflict. But when you eventually find your way to Caesar's fort, it gets a little interesting. Talking to the trader there, he talks of Caesar's controlled lands being very safe and secure, saying raiders are never a problem, and most civilians get on peacefully, just do what you're told if you're asked, or face the consequences. Then when you finally meet Caesar, you can hear his spiel about Hegelian dialectics and how Caesar's Legion is a necessary evil for the future of mankind, and how conquering NCR lands will create a societal solution through synthesis. So as you played through New Vegas, the world unfolded as many different perspectives came at you. Caesar's Legion are still the baddies, so to speak, but you see their warped perspective and how they logically come to their conclusions. Compare this to the Outer Worlds. You start in Edgewater and you start to see the negatives of corporate overlords and extreme capitalism, as you would assume, but I never learnt anything new about them or had my perspectives challenged. Some characters did have off-the-cuff lines about how they bring purpose and order, but nothing convincing. There was never a situation where, say I meet a character in Byzantium, perhaps Minister Clark, who maybe could have turned out to be a really fantastic, charitable guy who believed in bettering Halcyon for everyone, but also believed in due process and patience. He would be a far more sympathetic character and may convince you to side with the board, but as the game stands, siding with the board feels rather morally rotten. The worlds and planets do look really cool in the Outer Worlds, although I must say there wasn't enough of them to explore, and the game would feel more in-depth if there was Hephaestus and maybe Typhon or something as well. Also, we're not the biggest fan of Scylla. We can appreciate it being there, but it's pretty underdeveloped and feels a bit like, we need environmental diversity and somewhere else to send you for quests, so here's a bare asteroid. Another thing to talk about in regards to the world building is the enemy types in the game. The enemy creatures are pretty cool, and while there's not a huge variety, there's not a lack of it. There's Mantisaur-based enemies and Raptidons and Primals and Canids and Terra Rays, then you've got Automechanicals, that is all the different robots. However, there is a lack of variety with the human enemies, such as the plain Marauders. Marauders are very shallow in the Outer Worlds when compared to, say, the Raider gangs of Fallout New Vegas. None of them in the Outer Worlds have any character. They all look the same and just fall into different build categories, like you've got the heavy unit ones, the lighter marksman ones, and the more standard ones. There's also the generic outlaws, but there was no personification of any outlaw or marauder group, and they didn't have any cool hideouts or different factions. You know, realistic world-building elements. Gangs don't just stand in squads at various checkpoints along the road amongst generic ammo boxes and wait for you to come by. I liked how in New Vegas you had actual gangs with stories and lore. The Jackals, the Vipers, and the Fiends. You know, the Vipers are a group of tribal-type raiders with a shamanistic nature who originated from Vault 15, and then you've got the Fiends, who are this psycho gang of raiders who are addicted to chems, which are supplied to them by the Khans, and they're in control of Vault 3, and they've got these influential leaders with personalities like Motor Runner, Violet, Cook, and Driver Nephi, who are all characterized in their own way. And the Jackals are these kind of opportunistic savage types, and there's members who have filed their teeth to sharp points and sometimes carry out cannibalistic acts, and you can often find them trying to ambush you from smart hiding spots like behind a billboard. I can really remember distinct encounters with the Raider gangs in New Vegas, but compare it to the Outer Worlds and the generic marauders who just stand around locations or along the roads are made to look so plain by comparison. The Outer Worlds could have done marauders really well too, with tighter hub spaces to work with. Fallbrook brings some mercenary type vibes to the world, but they're not enemies obviously. I'd also give credit to the bounty collecting quest you can get in Edgewater, where you track down and eliminate 3 different outlaws, but beyond that, characterization of human enemies pretty much stops there. Now we've talked about companions a bit already, but what else is there to say? Well, whether or not you thought a certain companion was interesting will largely come down to preference in terms of their raw, straight-up appeal. Some people just see a companion and hear them say a few things and bam, they really vibe this character. So I'm not really here to say a whole lot about the characters themselves, but what I can do is focus on more objective aspects, like how deep their development was and if you can actually impact them. One thing we noticed was that companions don't really have any strong convictions. It is possible, but it is very hard to get a companion to leave you unintentionally, as they're just so agreeable. You can literally slaughter Parvati's hometown after she recommends that you don't, and she'll still stay with you and won't even care. You literally have to go out of your way and kill her lover for her to want to leave you, and even then you can persuade her to stay. Compare that to New Vegas, where you have companions like Boone, who will refuse to work with you if you side with Caesar, and just shoots Legion soldiers on sight. Or if you want Veronica as a companion, it's very hard to just blow up the Brotherhood of Steel and have her stay. So if you're doing a house playthrough and he wants you to destroy the bunker, it creates a situation where you're forced to make choices that will actually impact your companions, and perhaps choices your companions will make you reconsider. Parvati partly convinced me not to divert power away from Edgewater, but that's pretty much it. Vika can see the use in the board, seeing them as a necessary force of order, but doesn't mind if you side against them. Felix despises the board and will approach you about it if you help them, but nothing really comes of it, and he'll still help you as you help them. And if you side with the Iconoclasts and decide to take the fight to Stella Bay, Nyoka just says she hopes her drinking buddies don't die and stays with you as well. You can choose to help any faction, do criminal activities such as steal, have any philosophical stance, and none of your companions will leave you. Even though some companions were quite likable, the game does treat them less like characters with real decision-making power and more like tag-along mercenaries who will do anything you want. It is also hard to make meaningful impact in much of their development. For Parvati, her quest is all sweet and cozy and cute, but the fact that her big companion quest is a fetch quest involving collecting stuff for a date with a woman she just met is a bit of a letdown. Sure, it adds to her character, but it should have been a little side quest, as it's just not enough development for a main companion quest. It's being able to talk to your crush kind of development. And with Ellie, her development is kind of just, sometimes you do need help from people, which is a good thing for someone to realize, but it just feels a bit elementary as a main companion development arc. Now with Vicamax, he came across as a very interesting character because he actually seemed to have a strong ideology about how the world works and argues it passionately, but then his development is pretty much, I took DMT and realized I was wrong all along. I was such a jerk. There's no pacing with the development or having them change their minds about some really heavy themes gradually over time. There should be some catalyst points along the journey where characters constantly reflect and you have a chance to cause impact by trying to sway them one way or another. They will ask to talk from time to time, but what you say to them doesn't actually matter all that much. Of course, there's the end screens which change depending on what you do, but there's not heaps of change reflected in the actual game. If you look at Raul in New Vegas, he is dealing with growing old and feeling useless. He can be convinced to make peace with his age and focus more on being this kind of old, chill ghoul with lots of wisdom and skills, or you can have him live on with his passionate young gunslinger vibes all the way to the grave. Both choices are reflected with differing companion perks and companion aesthetics. With Veronica, you have the interplay of ideology and family. With Boone, you've got his struggle with PTSD coming from his direct involvement in the Bitter Springs massacre, and he also had to make a sacrifice, killing his wife instead of seeing her taken into slavery. Even in Fallout 4, you've got heavy themes. For example, Paladin Dance finds out he's a synth and that everything he stood for goes against his very being. He has to struggle with the uncertainty of where his manufactured life and real life begins and ends. There's also not a way to influence the characters' views very much. Sure, we want parts of their views that are removable, but then some parts you should be able to shape more. There was nothing like Knights of the Old Republic 2 where you can use your influence to turn a companion more into a dark side or light side oriented person. The idea is to have companions that have their certain perspectives that can be changed over time through your and their experiences together. Think about it like a relationship with a person in real life. You grow together and influence each other, or perhaps you grow apart, which would also happen in a game if they continually disagreed with what you did. But of course, people have those hard limits and convictions that cannot be changed as well, which can cause conflict. But by making the companions a bunch of yes men, it makes them feel less characterized.
Now let's talk about the problems with the length of the game in more detail. I'm not sure if there were time constraints in the game's development, but The Outer Worlds is a short game and can be comfortably completed in 15 to 25 hours if you do every quest and take in the game. However, if you're not a completionist, you may find yourself finishing it even quicker. Now, some people may be thinking, come on FudgeMuppet, what do you want? You've said before that you wouldn't mind a tighter RPG so that developers can focus on more quality over quantity, and now you've got a shorter game and you're not happy? Well, that's the thing. It's shorter than other RPGs, but it's not higher quality. There's more attention to some details like conversation integration between NPCs and companions, which was awesome, but ultimately in the key areas of a good RPG experience, it still falls short. Not horribly short, it's just no masterpiece. As far as pacing goes, you're really sucked in at Edgewater, and you're getting an idea of life under the rule of corporations, and when you're on this smaller groundbreaker place, and you're starting to learn more about the world and doing a few quests, and maybe you visit this little asteroid called Scylla, which appears to be one of the many planets you're going to be visiting, then if you side with the board, you hop over to Byzantium, and it's beautiful, and you don't realize it at first, but it's actually a very small place with very little to do, but otherwise it feels like everything's slowly starting to open up, and then you're on Monarch and things do get more interesting for sure, and you're quite impressed with that planet, but then bam, it's final mission time, the end. Maybe you went to Roseway to do some quests, but there's no other planets that you can go to. Monarch's the most fleshed out thing you can go to experience, and it turns out that the Emerald Vale, the starting area, is the second largest area to explore in the game. It's a cool location, but the fact it's large compared to everywhere but Monarch is a bit disappointing. Also, for some reason, if you do side with the board and go to Byzantium early on, you seem to be getting heaps of XP for doing quests, so if you're taking on and completing heaps of side quests, after about 3 hours of the game, it's possible to be around level 16. That's no exaggeration. And it ties into the stuff we were saying about the world building being a little bit shallow, because obviously, the more time you can spend in a game, the more opportunities there are for the lore to unravel in a deeper way. If there were more planets to explore, even just one planet the size and depth of Monarch, you would have way more time to sink yourself into the world building and care more about the characters and companions. Simply put, there would be more opportunity for various factions and corporations to be characterized. People build attachments to places when they spend time there. Hardly anyone is connected to Dawnstar in Skyrim as they are to the bigger cities like Whiterun. They have far more detail put into them, and you spend more time there doing quests, meeting more characters, and so on. I honestly think some of our critique would be minimized simply if there was actually another Monarch-sized planet and another Emerald Vale-sized area in the base game, because just by having more content, the game would last longer, the lore would be expanded upon more, and you'd have more time to form attachments to people and places. Companion quests should have also been a lot deeper, or at least we could have more than one companion quest. For example, say you wanted to keep the whole dinner date thing with Pavati, and that would be much more palatable as a companion quest if she had another companion quest that was much more epic and impactful. It would slow down the character development pace and make it more realistic, and the character would be fleshed out more, as would the world by simply having additional content. The problem with game length can extend to other characters too, such as Phineas. Sure, he's meant to be mysterious, but having more interactions with him due to increased story length would have really helped you enjoy him more. In games like Fallout New Vegas, you spend a lot of time talking to faction leaders like Robert House, or even characters like Yes Man. Yes Man may not be incredibly deep, but it's easy to form an attachment because you spend time around him. I mean, put it this way, I ended up with more of a relationship with Sanjar than most other characters in the game, and he's just one faction head of one planet. He's not even an integral main story character by the end of things. But because I spend so much time talking to him and doing quests on Monarch, I got to explore his character a lot. As Michael said in our 5 missed opportunities video about the Outer Worlds, it would have been much better if we could have spent a Monarch amount of time on Hephaestus, potentially with Graham and the Iconoclasts if they were instead located there, and there was something else to replace Amber Heights. Hephaestus is the closest planet to Halcyon's sun and was claimed by the Hephaestus Mining Corporation. From reading terminals, we know people live there, and I really hope we can go there in a DLC, but given the length of the base game, we feel like it should have been in it. And we have a little suspicion that the Iconoclasts iconoclasts were meant to be a faction of miners rebelling against the corporations on Hephaestus in the original vision for the game. It makes more sense if you consider that they're all wearing pieces of Hephaestus Mining Company armor, and it would fit in with a mining planet really well. They also have name titles such as iconoclast rioters, agitators, and revolutionaries, and this implies they take part in some rebellious, violent action, which they don't really until prompted by later events. But if they were a rebellious ex-miner faction on Hephaestus rioting against the Hephaestus Mining Corporation, these titles would make a lot more sense. Spending a lot of time here with Graham more than what's possible on Monarch would have made you more attached to him, and his ideologies would have been more convincing if you were witnessing the iconoclasts fighting against a corporation that is much more tyrannical than MSI. But then, if Byzantium wasn't so small, you could go there and meet some intelligent and likable board-siding characters who you also get attached to. Then your decisions feel impactful and difficult because you've spent lots of time attaching yourself to characters both strongly for and strongly against the board, and this extra time is only possible with a longer game.
Now let's talk about the gear. So weapons, armor, consumables, mods, all of that stuff. There are some really cool designs in the Outer Worlds, from Inferno scythes and plasma cutters to the automag pistol and the plasma carbines. Some of the weapon and armor models are really dope, but you don't need a pair of binoculars to see that the Outer Worlds doesn't have a huge variety of weapons and armor. I'd say the variety is nothing special, but it's not awful. If you actually look at a list of weapons in the game, it seems extensive enough when you consider it in scale to the length of the game, which is a bit short. However, in a similar way to Fallout 4, one of the problems is that you can turn the base weapon into other weapons through the use of mods. For example, you might find a unique pulse hammer, unique in the sense that it does shock damage, but you can just find a normal pulse hammer and apply a mod to make it deal shock damage. Many of these unique weapons in the game weren't truly unique for this reason, and were just modded up versions of base weapons you could modify yourself. There were some true uniques, but not a ton. There were the 5 science weapons, which had some wacky and fun things to play with, and were true uniques, which we can appreciate, even if they are a bit memey. To be slightly nitpicky, I'd also say I would have preferred if we got some newer weapons in place of things like Plasma Rifle 2.0 and Deadeye Assault Rifle 2. The armor was also a bit weird statistically. It didn't feel like heavy armor really penalized you unless you were a stealth character. You still get to run around and dodge and feel very agile, so there wasn't a strong incentive to using lighter armors instead. Yes, some of them did have good skill bonuses, which was neat, but then again, the armor rating given by heavy armor far outweighs any opportunity cost, plus they have the same amount of mod slots, and heavy armors can give great skill bonuses too. On the other hand, there are a lot of consumables, probably too much variety to the point where it becomes overwhelming and you don't really use many of them, and often their advantages aren't that great anyway. On top of that, you don't really need to use consumables to easily win battles outside of Adreno perhaps, so the incentive to use them goes down further. The mods were solid enough. I don't think there's much else to say here. Gear isn't something that was make or break in this game, but we thought it was worth mentioning. And that concludes our thoughts on why The Outer Worlds is not as good as many people think. As we said, The Outer Worlds is definitely not a bad game. It's decent, but it's definitely not the pinnacle of RPG potential either. Thank you so much for listening to everything we had to discuss. We really appreciate that you really hear what we're saying and take everything into consideration. What did you think? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're interested in following us on social media, our social links are also in the description with the timestamps.
A huge thanks to everyone for supporting FudgeMuppet. We're super grateful that people out there were as interested in this stuff as we are. This was Scott and Michael, and we look forward to nerding out with you again next time.